Salam and good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for all for joining us today. My name is Tuqa Nusayrat. I am proud to serve as the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or ISPU, which is hosting today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us and for your strong interest in this important topic. I know we have people joining us today who are familiar with ISPU and have been part of our community for a long time, and others who are new to our work, including some from outside of the United States. So, for those who are less familiar with ISPU, we are a nonprofit, non religious organization that has been conducting research on American Muslims since 2002. ISPU was founded in Michigan and now operates nationally. And the focus of ISPU is producing objective, solution seeking research and education on American Muslims and the issues affecting Muslim communities. And just as importantly, we work to put that research into the hands of policymakers, community leaders, journalists, educators, and the broader public. And we believe that there is a real need for accurate, credible information about American Muslims, and our mission is to help meet that need. So, whether you're an imam looking for research on divorce in the Muslim community, or a policymaker who wants to better understand Muslim voters, or a parent who's looking for data on bullying and the experiences of Muslim children in schools, ISPU aims to be a trusted source for you. As many of you know, our American Muslim poll was released in October of 2025, where we examined the 2024 elections, rising Islamophobia, and a range of other hot button topics. And we will continue to be releasing more data from that poll in the coming months. So I hope you'll stay tuned. And the best way to be able to get our latest updates is to subscribe to our newsletter. In addition to our research, ISPU really serves as a convener of experts, community leaders, researchers, and stakeholders for important conversations like this one, both online and in person, in public and in private settings. And today's webinar reflects the many conversations that have been taking place across our community, especially during Ramadan, about American Muslim giving and philanthropy. We know it's a wide-ranging topic, and we don't expect to cover every question or every perspective in one single conversation. But our hope is that bringing together expert voices will shed light on some of the most important themes under this broad umbrella. And it may necessitate another webinar, and we would welcome your feedback on that and any other topics that we should be discussing. As I mentioned, we encourage you to subscribe to ISPU's newsletter and stay up to date with our research, our events, and our engagements with decision makers and policy leaders. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, ISPU's board member Oussama Mezoui, who brings deep expertise of his own in the nonprofit and philanthropy space, and who is joining us from Doha. Oussama is the CEO and lead consultant at Mezoui Consulting Group, where he enjoys diagnosing, resolving, and transforming nonprofits so they can best serve their mission. He's the co-founder and former CEO of Penny Appeal USA, a social service relief and development organization. And Oussama has served in a number of leadership positions of faith-based organizations in the UK and the US. And he currently serves, in addition to being on the board of ISPU, a board director at Oxfam America. And if you want to read some of his recent articles, he's on Substack and Instagram, and you'll see the bios of all of our speakers in the chat. Over to you, Oussama.
Thank you, Toka. Hello, Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. There's been excellent response to this webinar. We had over 215 individuals registered and sign up. So thank you to all of those who've joined us, and thank you, Toka and the team, for putting this together. What I'd like to do is start off by introducing our panelists today. And I know that their full bios will be put in the chat. And so I'll do a high level biography for each of our esteemed panelists first to get us going. And then I'll spend just 5 minutes, if that's okay, setting the scene and level setting for all of us, giving us a bit of context to the conversation that we're having today. So let me start with Shireen. Shireen brings decades of experience in philanthropy and non-profit sector. She's led organizational transformation, resource development, and program strategy for various institutions. Most recently, she served on the Build team at the Ford Foundation, advancing the foundation's commitment to strengthening resilient, sustainable, and impactful social justice organizations and networks worldwide. She was at the Rise Together Fund before the Ford Foundation, which was a collaborative housed at the Proteus Fund, and has lots of experience, as I said, including at some point being the executive director of ISPU. So thank you, Shireen, for your time, and thanks for joining us. We have also with us Dilnaz. Dilnaz is the president of the WF Fund. She is a philanthropic advocate. She's a community builder, an educator. She's an interfaith leader with more than 3 decades of experience in building relationships, cultural sensitivity facilitation, spiritual engagement, and civic empowerment. As a fellow with the National Center for Family Philanthropy, she is known for bringing awareness and recognition to multiple causes. She was instrumental in establishing the Community Collaboration Initiative, Year of Learning at the Muslim and the Muslim Collaborative Prize, all of which were part of a 3-year community-based action research project hosted by Indiana University's Lilly School of Philanthropy. So thank you, Dilnaz, for being with us and for joining us. And last but not least, we have with us Mohamed, a PhD candidate at Indiana University in philanthropic leadership. Mohamed is a candidate studying philanthropic leadership. His applied research project examines how American Muslim nonprofit organizations can leverage internal diversity and inter-organizational networks to enhance collaboration and advocacy effectiveness on domestic policy issues. He holds a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and another master's degree in international development from American University in Washington, D.C. He works as a philanthropy program officer here in the United States for UNHCR, although to be clear, today he is representing himself as an academic and as a PhD candidate. So welcome to you, Mohamed, and thank you for being with us. As I said, I'd like to spend just 5 minutes before we jump into what I'm sure will be a very interesting, engaging panel discussion, really setting the scene, because we have individuals that have joined us today from all different walks of life. Some very, very familiar with philanthropy, who live and breathe philanthropy through their work, as I went through the list of names. And we have others who are philanthropists, who are donors, who are community members, who are interested to learn and to engage on this topic. And so I wanted just for a few minutes to make some brief points and really set the scene of the conversation and provide some context. A lot of the data that I'll be sharing with you will be shared with you in the comment section, so I'm not going to be quoting where I'm getting this data from. The research will be put in the chat and you can do a deep dive after this webinar. The first point, I have 5 points today. The first is really about scale. The American Muslim philanthropy has grown now into a quite significant force. Today, Muslim donors collectively contribute an estimated 4.3 billion, that's billion with a B, in charitable giving each year. Despite representing roughly 1.1% of the US population, American Muslims account for 1.4% of all giving nationally annually. Within that specifically, zakat accounts for roughly $1.8 billion annually. Much of it, of course, concentrated during this month of Ramadan. Surveys suggest that around 70% of American Muslims say that they consistently pay their zakat during Ramadan. And maybe for those not familiar with zakat, Of course, that's the best term is perhaps tithing or alms that is compulsory for Muslims to pay each year from their assets. So that makes Ramadan one of the most concentrated annual giving moments in American philanthropy. Giving is also deeply embedded in Muslim community life. Nearly 90% of American Muslims report donating to their local mosque, and Muslim Americans volunteer significantly more hours in faith-based activities than the general population. And the data shows us that the philanthropic impulse in the Muslim community is driven both by religious obligation on the one hand, and then a very strong ethic of social equity on the other. The second point is about where the money actually goes, because here I think there are some persistent misconceptions about American Muslim giving. There is an assumption that Muslim philanthropy primarily flows overseas, but the data we have actually tells a very different story. Roughly 85% of American Muslim charitable dollars are directed to causes in the United States, supporting mosques, schools, community organizations, poverty alleviation programs, and civil rights initiatives. When we look specifically at zakat, the picture becomes even more interesting. Research shows us that from zakat, 25% goes to international INGOs, about 18% to domestic non-profit organizations, and around 22% flows through what we call government-linked international aid channels. People giving to official government channels, maybe to their country of origin or to other Muslim majority nations. At the same time, about 15% of zakat is still distributed informally, given directly to relatives, to neighbors, individuals in need through community networks. And of course, a portion of this is sent through remittances back to family or friends in the country of origin. In terms of priorities, the top destination for American Muslim charitable dollars is poverty alleviation, both here in the US and internationally. This is followed by education, by healthcare, and support for mosques. Civil rights organizations also receive significant support. In fact, about 48% of American Muslims report donating to civil rights organizations, a much higher rate than any other faith group surveyed in the United States. My third point is about the evolving nature of the Muslim philanthropic ecosystem itself. We are seeing a gradual shift towards more institutional and strategic philanthropy in the community. Giving circles are emerging. We're seeing an increase in the number of Muslim family foundations, and we're seeing a lot more awareness of DAF's donor advised funds amongst American Muslims. And more organizations are trying to professionalize governance, transparency, and impact measurement. But there is also a tension in the system. Surveys suggest that many donors still prefer giving directly to individuals rather than institutions, often because they perceive it to be more transparent or more immediate. And of course, this has implications for how nonprofits build trust and demonstrate accountability. Fourth point is that we can't ignore the policy environment in which this Muslim American philanthropy operates. Since 9/11, Muslim charities have faced a level of scrutiny that has had a chilling effect on giving and on organizational development. More recently, we have seen renewed pressure through policy debates, funding disputes, legal challenges involving Muslim civil society organizations. Even when legal protections remain intact, the reputational and regulatory pressures can have real consequences for institutions and for donors alike. And then finally, point number 5 is that we're also seeing some important internal debates within the Muslim community itself. And I think today's interest in the webinar is indicative of that. One of the most prominent discussions this year concerns the ethical administration of zakat, as well as the scope of zakat, particularly whether it can be used for political purposes. A recent ruling or fatwa by the Fiqh Council of North America opened the door to using zakat for political campaigns under certain conditions. That ruling has sparked significant debate about religious integrity, donor trust, and ultimately the purpose of zakat. Another recent controversy surrounds the ethics of fundraising and the use of social media influencers. So, taken together, we have a sector that is large, that is generous, that is growing, but also that's currently navigating questions about trust, about good governance, dealing with a lot of political pressure at the moment, and the evolving interpretation of religious giving. And so that's the landscape that I'd like to explore with our panelists today. So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope that gives a little bit of context for the discussion. So, Dilnaz, I'm going to come to you first. Talk to us a little bit about the diversity of the Muslim American nonprofit sector that you engage with as someone who leads a family foundation. For many, I think what comes to mind when they think of Muslim nonprofit sector is automatically the big humanitarian organizations, relief development. But as the data shows, they actually are a minority recipient of Muslim American philanthropy. So just give us a flavor, Dilnaz, of the types of missions Muslim organizations are working on.
Sure. Thank you so much, Oussama. Thank you so much to the ISPU team for putting this webinar together. And I agree with you, Oussama. The fact that we're having these debates about zakat, about philanthropy, is actually a very healthy statement about our ecosystem. So I'm excited about, having these further conversations about the debates as well. So as far as philanthropy and where Muslim, family foundations, families really engaging with their funds. I'll start off with more of about the WF Fund and then grow into the larger ecosystem of philanthropy as well. So with the WF Fund, our family fund, we're catalytic funders, and we'd like to uplift and empower communities that are really focusing on strategic grant making, partnerships, storytelling that's rooted in the generosity and collaboration of the Muslim American community. The core principle of the WF Fund is really to approach it in a collaborative manner. And as we do this, we think about youth and how important it is for youth to get involved with understanding zakat and sadaqah from a really young age and not waiting until they're much older. Because actually, some of the research we're finding out, Osama, is that a lot of Muslims don't believe and actually don't fulfill their zakat pillar. So how do we make sure that it's rooted at home? And we're talking about this from, from 5 years of age to 25 years of age before adults are starting to give fully into their pillar of Islam. So with the different buckets of giving, I wanted to focus on three buckets of giving about grant making. And I think about religious pluralism, civic engagement, and human services. So when I think about religious pluralism, I think about promoting interfaith understanding, dialogue, and collaboration amongst religious communities. We can't do this work alone as we build nonprofits, as we build a stronger ecosystem in America, but we can do it collectively. And as we foster respect, reduce biases, and help build inclusive spaces, we want to make sure that other religions and other organizations are part of this as we strengthen this ecosystem. So some of the organizations that I would say in the religious pluralism bucket would be like Association of Muslim Chaplains. You know how chaplaincy work on campuses has really been very difficult during this genocide for the last 2.5 years. And how do we combat anti-Muslim hate? Another organization that we fund in religious pluralism has to do with Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, which is a national organization that tells stories of Muslim and Jewish women and telling the truth about the genocide. Then I think about right here in my backyard of Chicago, there's the Catholic Theological Union that has the Catholic Muslim Studies program. How do we make sure that Catholics and Muslims nationally are doing this work together? So another bucket I wanted to focus on is civic engagement. So the civic engagement bucket is really about empowering communities, particularly Muslim American communities that are underrepresented, and how do we fully live into our civic life? This includes making sure that our youth and our adults understand who's on the ballot, and we're politically understanding the importance of voting as well as who's in our districts. Leadership development, understanding advocacy and legislation work, initiatives that encourage civic participation, like going to your museum. Some great organizations in civic engagement are the Muslim Civic Coalition, making sure that we understand our ballot and we understand who we're voting for and understanding our civic power. Another great organization is the International Museum of Muslim Cultures, which is located in Jackson, Mississippi. How important it is for us to understand that a Palestinian man and a Black Muslim over 25 years ago started talking about civic engagement and museum leadership and having that conversation. Another organization I wanted to highlight is Muslim Writers Collective, making sure that we share our stories and we are doing the narrative change work and that no one else is telling our story. The last bucket I'm going to share is about human services, and it goes back to what you had mentioned, Oussama, about humanitarian need. So Muslims have always been giving to humanitarian needs, but we're very strategic about this, even more so now. When we think about workforce development, healthcare access, housing assistance, and programs that help develop individuals and families to overcome barriers and build stable, fulfilling lives. So some organizations that do this so well are Penny Appeal USA, right here in our backyard, making sure that we give daily meals, but we're also doing advocacy and legislation work for the homeless community, the veteran community, and domestic violence survivors. In Chicago and Atlanta, we've got Inner City Muslim Action Network, really focusing on re-entry individuals that never even had a first chance. So how are we saying that we're trying to give them a second chance, but making sure that they understand how to get professions that build into their barakah and help them live a full life while also understanding their generational trauma. In Chicago, we also have Shy Care that has a medical bus that does drop off meals, but really helps us understand orphans and miskeens in our community. So those are the three buckets that a lot of the Muslim community is focusing on, as well as the nonprofit community as well.
Thanks, Dilnaz. Excellent. And Mohammed, before I come to you, I think that's really the first message is the diversity of American Muslim philanthropy. It's yes, poverty eradication. Yes, we have a thriving humanitarian INGO sector. But I'm just looking at some of the names in the chat, and they represent organizations in education, in disability, as you mentioned, civic engagement. We have academic nonprofit organizations, interfaith. So storytelling and narratives telling. I think of the Islamic Scholarship Fund, for example, or Pillars and others. And so I think message number one is really just how diverse the American Muslim philanthropic scene is. Excellent. Mohammed, coming to you now, for part of your research looks at the internal diversity and the interorganizational networks that exist within Muslim American philanthropy. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on a little bit on the diversity of these networks and what you've seen in your research.
Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you, Osama. It's been a great honor and pleasure to be among these distinguished panels and a great moderator. I would like to give attributes first to Indiana University for launching the first of its kind, the philanthropic leadership, and I have the great pride and honor to be the first cohort in this program, and with an amazing committee with Dr. Kathy Badr-Chair and Dr. Sharik Siddiqui and Dr. Sahar Salud, who is the Director of Research at ISPU. Thanks to ISPU for hosting this important topic at this time. So to respond to your question, Osama, so one of the most important features of American Muslim philanthropy is its extraordinary internal diversity. So unlike any religious group in the United States, American Muslims do not represent a single ethnic or cultural group. So we have about 41% of white, like Middle East and North Africa, 28% from Asia, 20% of Black, and 8% of Latino. So this diversity shapes how philanthropic institutions operate. So Muslim nonprofit organizations reflect differences in race, in immigration history, in theology, in generation, even a professional background, which influence the leadership and structure, how these organizations set priorities and how they set advocacy strategies. So, for example, we know African American Muslim institutions often bring deep experience in civil rights organizing, while immigrant-founded organizations may emphasize on a humanitarian relief or international development. So this diversity can both be a challenge and a strategic asset. So a challenge when it operates in isolation, where these differences can create fragmentation. While if work collectively, they can be an asset for the community. They can build broad coalitions. They can represent multiple constituencies across American society. So my research highlight the growing importance of inter-organizational network. So the American Muslims work among themselves. They work with other faith-based organizations and with other organizations that share their values, they share the issues they advocate for, like civil rights, immigration, or humanitarian issues. And these networks allow for organizations to share resources, messages, and amplify policy influence. So the key takeaway from the research is that diversity and networks are not obstacle. They are a strategic asset. So when Muslim nonprofit organizations uh, intentionally and strategically leverage their internal diversity and strengthen collaboration, they can significantly expand their collective impact in philanthropy, in civic engagement, and in public policy.
Thank you, Mohamed. We'll get back to this point of networks and collaboration. Opening question for you, Shireen, is you are one of the few people I know whose career has spanned both the Muslim philanthropy and large institutional philanthropy. And so from that vantage point, what are a couple of core differences, if any, that you see between the two?
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be with you. Thank you, Oussama and the ISPU team. Wonderful to be with all of you. So I would say Muslim philanthropy and family philanthropy in general is rapidly growing with a lot of exciting opportunities. Dilnaz and her family have been at the forefront of this work. And I think the growth in this particular part of the philanthropic sector is where we're going to see a lot of new opportunities and innovation. So here are a few things I think that make it unique. One is that giving can be more flexible and more strategic. So individuals and families can decide to do political giving, support advocacy, support individuals, even support organizations internationally, as well as US-based nonprofits. Institutional philanthropy, on the other hand, is generally less flexible, with the majority of funding going to US-based 501c3s or their equivalent. Family and community philanthropy can also move more quickly and have more risk tolerance. And I know the question of risk is a big one. I'm going to come back to that, I promise. Individuals are often passionate about particular issues and communities, and thus we can move resources in sort of innovative ways to emerging organizations and to passion projects. Institutional philanthropy is just that. It's an institution. And many people who work in institutional philanthropy sort of work to balance risk and opportunity. As new needs emerge, they generally move slower to enter new areas and bring on new grantees. Now, this is also when family philanthropy and community philanthropy is at its best. And I think we have a lot to learn also from institutional philanthropy. One of the trends in institutional philanthropy is called trust-based philanthropy. So that's the idea that a nonprofit leader, not the donor, really knows what's best on how to solve the issue. It's that idea that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and that we should fund them with both flexibility and long-term support. In general, I think many smaller philanthropies and funders in our community are not quite there yet. We tend to think a lot about impact assessment, are heavy-handed sometimes with our reporting and check-ins and project management.
But this kind of transformational relationship that we can have with grantees actually also shifts the role of the funder. So one of the most important roles that I think we can play in philanthropy is not just to fund or sort of see the individual trees, but look at the whole forest. So we can help make connections, identify needs, see trends, and provide resources to think about how do we uplift entire fields and sectors. And that's hard to do when you're in the weeds with a particular grantee. I'll just give one quick example when I close. When I was at the Ford Foundation, we saw a huge number of executive director transitions kind of happening all at once. And it was actually a real threat to the sort of sector of social justice movements. We also saw this trend of a lot of interim executive directors coming in to lead those organizations, which actually, on the whole, is a good idea. But it created a new dynamic in the field. So rather than focusing on each individual organization, I was able to do some education with fellow funders about how to best support executive transitions, bring together a cohort to support those interim executive directors on how to manage this kind of awkward in-between stage that they might be in, and how to think about and support healthy transitions. So that would have been hard to do had I just been focused on a single organization and not thought about the sector as a whole.
Shireen, let's do this. Let's take a step back. We're getting questions. Thank you for that. We're getting questions on defining philanthropy. And so I think that's probably a good place to start as well, and maybe for those who are new to this. And the question is philanthropy synonymous with non-for-profit? Or can it have a different organizational structure? That was the specific question. But let's talk at a high, I mean, how are we defining philanthropy?
So I think it can, I think that's part of what I was saying is I think there's an opportunity to think about philanthropy more flexibly if you're thinking about family foundations, individual donors, et cetera. There's a lot more flexibility in that sector to think about how do we fund and who we fund. There's the emergence, as you mentioned earlier, of donor advised funds and even LLCs that can do charitable giving. So there is actually a wide range of flexibility. It doesn't have to be to a 501c3 nonprofit. And I think the way people are thinking about giving is becoming more strategic. So we can think about political giving. We can think about supporting organizations and networks that are not formal institutions. Traditionally, philanthropy, in the institutional sense, has been a little bit more rigid in its definition, where it's sort of a transactional giving of money to an institution that is established and has sort of a tax deductible status with the IRS. But I think what we're seeing now is that people are being much more creative in how they think about giving in philanthropy. And that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. I welcome Dilnaz or others if you want to weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, and maybe I jump in here. So from research perspective, there are some scholars who talk about this from different perspectives. So they refer to charity as any voluntary way of giving that is a charity. This could be time, this could be money, this could be attitude, behavior, anything. Whereas if my contribution leads to an impact, that's philanthropy. And this is where people come to give mindfully for a purposeful impact. So if you think about this at the humanitarian level, where we can reach into an sustainable impact, and this is what is called in Islam al-ihsan. So that is a kind of philanthropy where we know that my contribution leads to a sustainable impact. At the policy level, I know that my contribution leads to making a significant change at the policy level, domestic or federal level, but that's where I'm shaking and I'm contributing to making a contribution and positive impact on the community through shaping policy. That is also part of philanthropy.
The other comment I was going to make, Mohamed, I appreciate what you were mentioning, is how important it is for us to realize that as we're giving, we're always giving to please God from the Muslim perspective. And it's not always about having our name on our wall or making sure that we are recognized for our giving. But number one and foremost is that we're pleasing God and we're fulfilling a pillar of Islam. And that's what the Muslim community, when we give our philanthropy, when we give our charitable giving, that's the number one reason. That isn't true with institutional philanthropy, as Shireen is pointing out to us. Institutional philanthropy a lot of times is really just about creating a stronger community, and that's a very important aspect. But it's not about the pleasing of God, which is what the Muslim community is grounding its way of giving as well. The other comment that Shireen made about how Muslim philanthropy can move quickly and also is a bit more fluid than institutional philanthropy is what we're really seeing in the Muslim community as well. Because we don't have 3-year gift agreements, or because a lot of times we don't have contracts, we are able to just give and kind of pivot on a regular basis. I don't think that is always really positive as well. I do think contracts are a good relationship. It's a good trust building activity between nonprofits and philanthropists / donors as well. And this goes back to an Substack article that Oussama recently published as well. Really identifying yourself as an impact philanthropist gives you the ability to think long term about what's the impact I want to make in my community? What's the impact I want to drive others to understand about my Islamic giving as well, opposed to just writing a check and walking away.
Thank you all. I hope that helps define philanthropy, and I think we are defining it in the broadest terms in this conversation. One more definition before we move on is collaboration and how we define collaboration. So maybe Mohammed, I'll come to you. And I think many people, when they think of collaboration, it's kind of one big happy tent, one big happy family. And of course, when we talk about collaboration, it's often complementary. It's often about bridging gaps. It's often about impact and increasing impact through collaboration. But can we just very briefly, each of you, maybe 30 seconds, please, how do you think of collaboration within philanthropy? And I'll start with you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Oussama. When we talk about the American Muslim nonprofit organizations, I think about collaboration from within first. How can American Muslim organizations work in collaborative manner and not work in parallel? How they can share the resources, they can share the impact and the messages to create the ultimate mission of their existence. So that is the first part, and that is the first kind of safe haven umbrella for the community when these internal collaboration come to exist. The second layer of collaboration is external, and this comes through different coalitions, through faith-based coalitions or civic coalitions on issues and that are sharing the same values of these organizations. This constructive, systematic approach would lead to more positive and sustainable impact for these organizations and for the communities they serve.
So yes, collaboration is important, but it's one of the hardest things to do for donors as well as nonprofits. And when you think about nonprofits, they're underfunded, they're constantly limited in time, they're scrutinized all the time because it's not their funding and they have to report back to the donor. So when you have an ecosystem of nonprofits constantly having to work so hard, it's very hard for them to collaborate. And even though we think collaboration is lovely, there just isn't the time, the money, the resources to do this collaboration. So a lot of times what funders will do is say, if you fund together for 5 years, we will, if you work together for 5 years, we'll fund you for that project. Unfortunately, the 5 years, those nonprofits do work together. And when the funding is gone, then the nonprofits don't work in further collaboration. But it's also a mindset change. How do we change the mindset of the nonprofits as well as the donor to better understand? It's important for us to not be in our silos. It's important for us to understand the research that's being done by Mohammed and Lily School of Philanthropy about the importance of collaboration and how collaboration makes us go farther and faster because we're doing it together. So one of the researchers that we did with the WF Fund was a community collaboration initiative where we brought together 22 Muslim-led nonprofits for 3 years. And the first year was about just building trust. It's very hard to build trust. And we're going to talk more about trust building in this webinar. But the first year was just about building trust. The second year is about like doing some project together. How do you do some small project together that all these nonprofits want to do together in their sector? And the third thing is after you've built the trust, after you've actually done some project together, then fundraise together, write some grants together so you can get more funding to do this work. So collaboration is very much built on trust, and building that trust is not easy, but it can be done with a mind shift.
Thanks, Dilnaz. Shireen, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I'll maybe just add a couple of things, maybe more from the funder or putting the onus more on funders. So one is, I think if we want collaboration to happen, we actually have to put the resources to organizations to make it happen. As Dilnaz and others mentioned, it takes time, it takes coordination, it takes someone taking the notes and sending the follow-up meeting. Like that all creates more burden on organizations. So we should fund them and resource them to do that work, or provide some back-end support to make that happen. The other, idea I want to put out there is how can funders coordinate better with each other and actually make it easier for nonprofits? So I, for a number of years, ran a collaborative fund at the Proteus Fund. We pooled resources from a number of donors to be able to make strategic grants into Black, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian organizations. And we helped to make connections, make introductions, streamline some of the funding process so that the organizations could build relationships through sort of a trusted entity. But what if we had like a common application for organizations to apply for funding so they weren't creating, 7 grant reports and 7 proposals every year? I think we can really be creative in how we think about collaboration on the funding side as well.
Excellent. Thank you all. Let's jump into some of the challenges that Muslim organizations and Muslim philanthropy generally face. Mohammed, let's start with an obvious one, which is Islamophobia. And if you could just describe a few of your research findings on how Islamophobia impacts Muslim charitable organizations.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Oussama. This is very, very important question. Islamophobia has been expressed in the United States through a variety of mechanisms, including hate crimes, bullying, media stereotypes, employment discrimination, and selective enforcement of laws and policies. Muslim communities experience some of the highest level of religious discrimination in the United States. So according to ISPU, American Muslim Poll 2025, the National Islamophobia Index rose from 25 in 2022 to 33 in 2025, reflecting a significant worsening of public attitudes towards Muslims. So researchers identified 1,096 funding organizations supporting 39 anti-Muslim groups between 2014 and 2016. These groups, the 39 anti-Muslim groups, out of 1,096 organizations been funding them, collectively generated about $1.5 billion in revenue, illustrating a well-resourced institutional ecosystem sustaining anti-Muslim narratives. So why I'm saying these figures? Because Islamophobia is an structured approach in this country. It's not a kind of ad hoc approach being practiced against Muslim communities in the United States. A major finding of this research is that Islamophobia does not only affect individuals. It directly shapes how Muslim charities and charitable organizations operate. For example, Muslim charities have faced asset freezes, investigations, and increased regulatory scrutiny under counterterrorism financing policies. Many organizations report bank de-risking, where financial institutions close or heavily monitor accounts due to perceived risk. So this is one of the biggest challenges that Muslim organizations face in the United States. One of the interview I interviewed for this research says that Islamophobia is the biggest enemy for the Muslim community, and we collectively have to do something about it. So organizations often spend significant time proving compliance, managing reputational risk, and responding to scrutiny. And this, of course, require lots of financial resources and time and spending money for lobbying and getting access to Congress. And this is like a lot of waste of resources. So this, of course, has an impact on donors as well, because some of these organizations been asked for a list of the donors, and some of these organizations been affiliated with supporting terrorist groups. And this brings and creates fears among donors. And so this, of course, show some kind of donor fatigue or donor decline towards these organizations. Of course, there is, of course, a reputational risk engaged here. And also from a philanthropic point of view, this provides unequal philanthropic ecosystem, because all Muslim organizations operate under the same government rules and regulations, whereas they were not and they are not being treated equally compared with other organizations. So coming to the point of Muslim organizations, as part, you mentioned, Oussama, that 85% of the donations, like Muslim giving, $4.3 billion, are spent in the United States. The question is, how much of this money is leveraged to address Islamophobia? How much of this money has been addressed towards institutions, organizations, or research centers like ISPU and others to address issues of Islamophobia? Because this is like number one issue and a challenge that has been affecting the Muslim communities.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I think just to draw back to what you said at the beginning, which is fascinating, I think a lot of people think that Islamophobia is due perhaps to some kind of implicit bias, or maybe it's due to just some ignorance. They don't have many Muslim neighbors. But what you're saying is actually no, that this is a very strategic, well-funded anti-Muslim agenda with thousands of funders and dozens of organizations committed to this narrative, anti-Muslim narrative. And so I think it's really important to remember that this is structural, that this is institutional, and that this isn't just average ignorance or implicit bias. Dilnaz, so we've heard from Mohammed, and we know that Islamophobia is a reality that impacts Muslim-led or Muslim-focused organizations. Can you speak to some of the work that Muslim philanthropists like you have been doing to counter Islamophobia, counter misconceptions and stereotypes about Islam and Muslims in the philanthropic space? I mean, you are one of the few Muslims, visible Muslims as well in the quote unquote mainstream philanthropic space. You're in those meetings, you're on those conference tables. Talk to us a little bit about what you've seen and also what you're doing and what others are doing, as Mohammed said, to counter this very well-funded machine.
So I want to exclamation point what you said and what Mohammed said. We need more funding to collect the effects of Islamophobia for the Muslim community, and we are just not collecting enough data on this. The anti-Muslim hate, the Islamophobia just needs more funding, more research, more individuals to be doing this work to really get a good idea of how to, make sure that we combat this, but also make sure we take it to the White House and make sure that legislation and advocacy as work is done on this as well. So I wanted to make sure I highlight the two comments that both you and Mohammed had made as well. So when I think about philanthropy and what philanthropy is doing to combat anti-Muslim hate, I think about narrative change work. The narrative change work I'd mentioned earlier is very slow. And how do we shift narratives about the Muslim? How do we expand Muslim participation in leadership in philanthropic sectors? Well, we do that by telling our story. And it's not easy to tell our story when someone else is always telling our story for us, and when someone else is always telling us we're less than. So when this happens over and over again, there gets to be a point in time in our life where we're just like, you know what, we're just going to sit back. And I am so appreciative of the comment that I saw in the chat about womanhood and women in philanthropy. I remember when the transfer of wealth occurred in our own family, and it took me like 2 years to get over that imposter syndrome of a woman being in the philanthropic sector. And I realized I don't really need to go out and look for other women that have done this well. It's someone that I've known all my life, which is Khadija Radiallahu anha, who is the Prophet's wife, who is the leader in the Muslim community. And she's been one of the greatest philanthropists that I've known of. So, how do we combat Islamophobia and look within our own faith traditions to find good leadership in philanthropy and model that as well? So, as we do narrative change work, I also think about what the WF Fund is doing with Inspired Generosity. So, Inspired Generosity is a storytelling showcase of the generosity of the Muslim American community. We first started in Atlanta in 2024. We were in Chicago in 2025. And alhamdulillah, we're starting on March 24th to launch Inspired Generosity Minnesota. There is no state that has gone through such unrest, such civic disengagement as Minnesota has. And the Muslim community in Minnesota has risen and has been neighborly and have been supporting each other. So we're telling those stories in Minnesota starting March 24th through Inspire Generosity. But I think of other great organizations doing strategic grant making and capacity building, which is Pillars Fund. So Pillars Fund, again, is a Chicago-based grant making organization. They've been around for 15 years. They bring together high net wealth individuals and they amplify leadership, narrative change work, and talents in the Muslim American community and the nonprofit, as well as in the Hollywood community, to make sure that we uplift to these stories. Another organization that's been doing this extremely well for the last 10 years is Launch Good. So Launch Good demonstrates the Muslim connectivity of philanthropy from the $5 giving to the $50,000 giving. The digitization of fundraising and the donor engagement has genuinely been transformed with what Launch Good has been doing for the last 10 years. Now we've got these peer platforms, we've got electronic giving wallets, we have the one-click zakat calculators. We have been able to collect millions of dollars overnight because of these digital platforms. And LaunchGood has been really leading this charge also to build interfaith relationships. When there were Black churches that were burned, when there were Jewish burial sites that were shot at in Pittsburgh as well, how we were able to collect funding through the LaunchGood. I also think about, as we think about women and philanthropy, how American Muslim Community Foundation has the Women's Giving Circle, the Women's Giving Circle led by, Lisa Kaler. She's been really getting women together to give pooled funding. Pooled and collective decisions to make a direct impact is so very important. And lastly, I really want to highlight the work of Muslim Philanthropy Initiative at Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy. They are leading the research in this and how research is just not funded well enough. But MPI has been driving this philanthropic sector to better understand how important it is to fund development, fundraising training, to fundraise research being done in this area. And it's been happening for the last 5 to 6 years with MPI as well. So those are areas that I wanted to highlight. And that's what philanthropy and Muslim philanthropy has been highlighting to make sure that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate is being combated.
Thanks, Dilnaz. Shireen, I'm going to come to you with a question that's already been asked now a number of times in the Q&A. And it's something that anyone who's kind of a keen follower of internal Muslim community discussions is well aware of. This issue of fundraising ethics, this issue of trust, and these are all connected. When I think of Islamophobia, something that maybe we can touch on later, Mohammed, is this idea also of internalized Islamophobia. And what we've seen is a lot of people start to believe a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric and therefore stay away from giving to Muslim organizations or perhaps hold Muslim American institutions to a higher level. And internalized Islamophobia has all sorts of different permeations. But what we're seeing specifically this Ramadan and leading up to Ramadan is a lot of debate around the ethics of fundraising, around the ethics of zakat administration, the issue of trust and transparency, or perhaps lack thereof. And I wanted to get your perspective, Shireen, on some of the internal challenges faced by Muslim organizations that maybe lead to some of the mistakes that are being made or some of the struggles that they face. And I would maybe controversially say that a lot of it is actually, and hold your breath here, it's due to a lack of investment in overhead, what's considered overhead, right? I think one of our biggest challenges as a sector is the lack of investment in back-end operations, the things that make an organization work well and transparent and communicative and well governed and compliant. And what are your thoughts, Shireen? I mean, I think that's one of our biggest challenges in the Muslim American philanthropic scene. So kind of multiple questions there is the reality of where we are and some of the controversies that we've all seen in recent weeks and months, and what's causing that, and then the issue of internal capacity and investment in internal capacity.
Yeah, thank you. This is a big question, and I'm sure everybody on this call probably has their own opinion. I'll share a couple of points from my sort of professional experience in this space, which is I agree. I think that, as I have funded and engaged with institutional philanthropy and some of the leading nonprofits around the world, the big difference I see between American Muslim nonprofits and some of the leading global nonprofits that I have had the chance to work with is this investment in professionalism and excellence. That means funding the things that people might call overhead cost. Within institutional philanthropy, we have this understanding of institutional strengthening. So this is an area that I worked in really extensively at the Build program at Ford, which was sort of known for the fact that we gave large multi-year grants, so long-term commitments, as Dilnaz was saying, and we actually required that organizations spent 20 to 40% of that grant on institutional strengthening. So that was things like human resources, hiring their first finance director, getting legal counsel, all of the things that most funders actually don't want to fund and aren't really that interested in talking about. We actually talked about it all the time and made deliberate investments in those areas. Ford was also part of a study that look to assess what is the true overhead cost? What are the real costs of running an organization? We found that it was at least 25%. And so Ford Foundation shifted a few years ago to make the minimum indirect cost rate on project grants to be 25%. So when you contrast that with some of the recent conversations about waste or fraud, people saying, oh, we need to have 90, 100% of donations going directly to the cause or the charity. I actually have a lot of concerns about that because I don't think that you can run a healthy organization that way. We need to invest in the people who are doing, as you said, the legal compliance, the due diligence, the support of administering those programs effectively, of creating opportunities to learn lessons and share that with others in our sector. There is much more to the nonprofit sector than just the pure sort of transaction of funding. So I think that those are really important conversations and a place where I think our community really has some important conversations to have about how we prioritize the professionalization of our staff, making sure that we have executive directors who may be dynamic and visionary. They may not actually be the best person to run the operations of an organization. So we should also invest in operations managers, HR directors, fundraising staff. That is what it takes to lead a healthy and sustainable organization over the long run. And I think we have a long way to go in terms of thinking about that sustainably within our sector.
Dilnaz, talk to me a little bit about where you think a lot of these controversies are coming from, this perception of, and I think it's not just a perception, I think there are valid questions being posed by our community that funds much of this effort. And so I think these are valid questions around effectiveness, around efficiency, around waste, around the use of paying, for example, commission-based pay structures for influencers and celebrities. I think these are genuine conversations and quite rightly being asked by the community. I'd love to know just how you think about this and where you think a lot of this is coming from, and how you approach this issue of trust or transparency or lack thereof.
So I think there's two communities we're talking about. Number one, we need to talk about the African American community and how the African American community has been here for over 400 years. And they've been building these communities, these ecosystems. And there's been racism. There's been so much, anti-Blackness hate within the Muslim community as well as outside the Muslim community. So that's one community. Then there's the other community, which is the immigrant community. And the immigrant community is coming from countries where those countries took care of the nonprofits. The mosque took care of the people. So what happens is a lot of those individuals come to the US. They become high net wealth individuals. They have that old mentality of like, why would I pay 25% for overhead? I think it should, I am not kidding. Someone said it should be 3% of the overhead. And I'm like, 3%? Like, how can you have a living if you're just paying 3% for overhead? So these are conversations that we're having. And I'm so glad, again, we're having healthy debates about where does zakat go? What is zakat? Operational expenses. And we're having these outward conversations. Just as an example, if I was going to go to Shireen's house and it was time to pray Usher, I'd be like, oh, Shireen, I need to pray Usher. Do you have a spot for me to pray? Or we would just talk about Salat. But I think these are open conversations when we're talking about Zakat. Oh, I'm giving my Zakat here. What are your thoughts about it? I'm curious. Do you do you think that's Zakat eligible? If we don't have these kitchen table conversations now, what will happen is this uncomfortableness of these conversations will just keep going on, and we won't have more research done on it. And like we all know, there's 8 categories of zakat, and so as a Muslim, you have the ability to make that discerning decision with you and your family where your funds should be going. But I also think as a community, we should be respecting everyone to be able to get a livable wage. And the fact that a lot of individuals believe, overhead should be very minimal, that also shows us the respect we have for nonprofits doing this work, the respect we have for individuals giving out zakat for the nonprofits as well. So I think it's a conversation that our, imams, but our everyday Muslims need to have as well.
Thank you. Just going back to Mohammed, one of your findings in your dissertation is going back to collaboration, this issue of organizations operating in silos. And I think this is connected actually to the overhead, and I hate that phrase, question, right? Is there efficiencies to be made through better collaboration, through shared resources, pooled resources? And so my question is, I know that one of your findings from the dissertation is that Muslim organizations operate in silos, not really in a coordinated fashion. So can you describe to us how this kind of impedes the work of these organizations practically, and what steps they can take to move from fragmentation to increased coordination?
Thank you, Oussama. Absolutely. One of the most consistent findings from interviews and organizational analysis is that many Muslim nonprofit organizations operate in parallel rather than partnership. So this fragmentation creates several challenges. Number one, resources. So you can imagine the level of financial and human resources being distributed among all different organizations doing the same thing rather than coming together in partnership. And I'm here referring to policy because my research focus on how we can leverage those networks and diversity to enhance domestic policy issues. And since my focus is in policy, I'm thinking about the resources from an economic perspective, how we can save lots of resources if we come to work together. Another challenge that this working in silos have is when we work separately and in a fragmented manner, this dilutes policy influence. Usually, policymakers are more responsive to coalitions than to fragmented voices. And when organizations send different messages or advocate separately, it weakens the community's ability to shape legislation or public discourse. Another message that this creates is mixed policy signals. We're talking about 1% of American population is like Muslims. And if you can imagine about all different organizations conduct different policy advocacy messages, and then policymakers hear different messages, so that will give weaken our position. Research shows that when communities lack coordinated agendas, policymakers often perceive them as disorganized or less credible. So this is particularly concerning, given that we're talking about 1% of the population as Muslims, yet advocacy infrastructure remains relatively underdeveloped compared with other communities. So you ask about the way forward, and the research identifies several practical and achievable pathways for strengthening collaboration and advocacy. Number one is institutionalize advocacy as a core function. And what I mean by that, when we look into American Muslim nonprofit organizations, we talk about research show about 5,600 Muslim organizations registered in the United States. 95% of these organizations are structured as 501c3 charities. The sector lacks dedicated policy vehicles here. And so one of the recommendations is to develop more 501c4 advocacy arms and policy teams that can allow organizations to engage more strategically in public policy. Number two is to treat internal diversity as a strategic capital, and this requires leadership. I'm referring to existing Ramadan, as most of Muslims in this country fast. I would say that we have received and we have experienced a red flag this year, where two mosques in the same county fast at 2 different days. I'm not talking about the whole country fast on a different day compared with another country. I know families where family members at the same house fasted different days. So this is part of the fragmentation because we lack leadership. I would say we can agree on the minimum that can unite us all, that can bring all the community together on the basis of the minimum that would give one voice on major issues that of concern to the community. Number three is local engagement is essential. Many interviewees emphasize that building relationships with local level community boards, city councils, local coalitions create credibility, and this translates into a state and federal influence. Number four is faith-based and cross-sector coalitions like civil rights organizations, interfaith networks, immigrant justice groups, and many so on and so forth with groups that share the same values and principles with Muslim organizations. These alliances amplify policy influence and strengthen legitimacy. Number five is to invest in leadership pipeline. Dilnaz talked about different groups, including African American Muslims, converts, youth, and women. We need to see more of those voices, especially with leadership charismatic people who are fluent in language, fluent in culture, fluent in understanding the politics and the micropolitics of this community. The more we get of this leadership, I think we can enhance the impact for moving forward. And number six, I would like to say, is to mobilize philanthropic capital strategically. What I mean by that, you talked about, Oussama, about $4.3 billion of American Muslim giving in this country, where we know that this philanthropy is growing significantly. Yet, most of the giving supports humanitarian relief and religious services and local charities. That is important. However, we need to dedicate a portion, a percentage of this money towards policy research, like ISPU and many research centers, towards advocacy infrastructure, towards coalition building that can dramatically expand civic influence. I know American Muslim community is small in number, but they are rich in resources. However, we need to strategize and to join forces how we can collectively build this towards making an impact at the domestic level, which will definitely lead into a federal level.
Thank you, Mohamed. Dilnaz, we're getting a lot of questions about zakat. I think it's only right that I ask you one of those questions. And this question is, there are many religious leaders that emphasize that zakat should be for needy people, despite the fact that we have 8 recognized categories. Is there a way we can look beyond zakat to better fund our institutions? Or will our communities always be held hostage by this zakat debate?
So I think that goes back to, again, like having these conversations. And that's why I really appreciate Pillars Fund. And then there's a couple of other collective giving circles. So when you have these collective giving circles, there's a trust in that giving circle. And in that giving circle, high net wealth individuals and individuals that want to even just give $5 per month, they can have conversation and ask the difference. What's the difference between sadaqah? What's the difference between zakat? Where can my sadaqah go? Where can my zakat go? And if we don't have these very honest, difficult conversations, we're stuck in like everyone just has to give zakat, and zakat is the only way we can build these nonprofits. Zakat is the only way we can build this infrastructure and be civically engaged. That's not true. It has a lot to do with humility. It has a lot to do with giving more than the basic necessary. So if you move past the basic necessary, then you get into sadaqah. So where can sadaqah go, and how can sadaqah help to really talk a little bit more about transparency and accountability gaps? A lot of times Muslims sometimes don't give to other Muslim organizations because they don't know if these charities are really transparent, if they're going to get statements of audit, if they get impact reports, if they're not getting emails returned by certain executive directors. So making sure that sadaqah is part of this conversation is very important as well.
Yeah, and a reminder too, Dilnas, from the data I shared at the beginning, that actually, we said 4.2 billion in annual giving, and less than 50% of that is zakat. I think the data shows 1.8 billion of that is zakat. So there is a sizable, a significant amount of money available, for philanthropy and for these institutions, which is not zakat, number one. And then a reminder, number two, and I don't have the data in front of me, but I think those of us in this space all agree and all know anecdotally that many people don't give zakat. So that's a massive area of potential growth. While at the moment, it's not even 50% of Muslim giving. I want to kind of, on the back of what Dilnaz finished with, Shireen, do you think that Muslim organizations are led to a higher standard? And I would ask by both, I would say traditional foundations and maybe by our community itself. I'd love your thoughts on that, Shireen. So, are Muslim organizations held to a higher standard, both by traditional philanthropy and then perhaps by our community itself? And have you seen that evolve, any changes in the last 5 or so years, 10 years?
Yeah, I think we've talked about some of the areas maybe within the American Muslim philanthropy sector where we're seeing, I think, evolution. But I do think we hold our community organizations to a high standard, sometimes because we know the people who are leading them, sometimes because we think as donors we know those issues, maybe even better than the people who are running those organizations. So this kind of gets back, I think, a little bit to what I was saying before, this idea of trusting the leaders of organizations that have dedicated their careers to working on these issues, and understanding that maybe our responsibility are to mobilize resources to help those leaders do the work that they want to do. So I do think that can be a challenge. On the institutional side, I don't know that I would say that Muslim-led organizations are held to a higher standard, but I actually do think we have obstacles to even being considered. So, we've talked a little bit about Islamophobia, institutionalized Islamophobia, and the idea that Muslim communities pose risk. There's no denying that that is deeply embedded in our society. And I think many people who work in philanthropy, their job is to try and reduce risk for their institutions. So we know that risk can mean a lot of different things, but I think it's definitely easier to label something as risky when it is unfamiliar and when we are communities who have clearly been targeted by those in government, media, et cetera. So there's a few things that I would say. I've probably spent my whole career trying to figure out how to address some of these issues. One is I would say education is the key. When I was at Rise Together Fund, we did a lot of work to connect donors directly to frontline communities doing the work. And I'll always remember we arranged a site visit and like an engagement and panel and community visit with Drum in New York City. One of the individual donors that was part of our donor community, said to me at the end of this, it was amazing to see that those who believe in the promise of this country the most are the ones who continue to be sidelined and targeted by its policies. So what he saw was the organizing work of Drum as being the most patriotic expression of American values. It was like transformative for him. He talked about it publicly and continues to like refer to that experience. I'll give another quick example. When I was executive director of ISPU, we did this study, I think it was mentioned earlier, around divorce in the Muslim community. And at that time, there was an Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Services that existed within different federal agencies. I went and talked to the person at Health and Human Services who worked on issues around divorce and family support in the American community. I talked to her about the data and she said to me, I didn't even realize that divorce was an issue in the Muslim community. And I was like, we get married, so obviously like we're going to have divorces. So she was the director of faith-based initiatives and had not even thought to consider the Muslim community in her outreach. So I think that leads me to my next point, which is that we need more leaders from our community in philanthropy. Being at a decision-making table really matters. Being visible, talking about the work of our community and being sort of a trusted leader in that space, as Dilnaz and so many others that we've talked about have paved the way for, is incredibly, incredibly important because we can speak with credibility about the Muslim community as well as build relationships with funders. So we need more of us in those decision-making spaces. But I also want to end with something that I think is important and deserves to be sort of mentioned out loud, is that our communities bring a lot to the table as well. So, we've talked a bit about the way our communities have been targeted, but the truth is, and going back, as Dilnaz, you've mentioned, to our African-American brothers and sisters, we have a lot of deep expertise in what broader communities are facing now. We understand domestic terrorism laws. We understand surveillance. We understand a lot of these issues that unfortunately we have been disproportionately impacted on. So we can be leading and building coalitions with Muslim leadership at the top. And I think that's incredibly important to articulate and to talk more about. The other thing that I just want to say is that we have a lot of credibility because we are able to get community resources. So, putting the debates aside about zakat and sadaqah, when I was first came on board as the executive director of ISPU and applied for my first foundation grant, when I was able to say that we raised at that time, I think around $1 million a year from the community, it gave us a lot of credibility. Most nonprofits actually have a hard time raising money from the community. So the fact that we have such a generous and engaged community, of course, we as we've talked about, we can do more. But that gives our organizations a lot of credibility. So we also bring a lot of assets, I think, to the table when we're talking to institutional funders.
Thanks, Shireen. I'm going to tackle the question myself. And there's a lot of zakat questions, and I apologize. We won't be able to get to all of them. But I've seen this said many times now in the community on social media and other places around the need for some sort of Muslim-focused watchdog. Okay. And that's much easier said than done. And so I don't have a solution. What I have is some challenges for us to think through. And so there are lots of folks saying, you know what, we have to go beyond Charity Navigator and Candid, and Muslim specific watchdog would be very useful. And I think there are a few challenges. I think number one, the criteria or the metrics can be very subjective, right? And some of you who are reading some recent controversial articles about the zakat, how you define a legitimate program spend. Different people have different perspectives on what a legitimate program spend is or isn't. If you think about the fact that these organizations would have to opt in, right? I mean, we wouldn't have any ability to force organizations or institutions to opt in. Of course, there's the reality of you're dealing with individuals, many founders. There is a reality of people that have committed decades to these initiatives, to these missions, who will not all agree on what a good charity regulator should or should not be kind of intervening in. And I think the biggest challenge for us is there is no one size fits all. So when I think of ISPU, where I sit on the board, ISPU's accounting, ISPU's needs, ISPU's operations as a organization that does research is fundamentally different to an Oxfam America, where I also sit on the board. Okay, Oxfam being an organization that does mostly advocacy and direct service work. You know, the needs of a research organization versus the needs of a humanitarian are fundamentally different in spend, in accounting, in investment. And so I think it's very difficult. And one of the challenges has been for folks who have been thinking about some kind of Muslim watchdog or Muslim regulator is that there is no one size fits all, that descriptions are quite subjective. And that's why when you read the 990, and a lot of the controversy has been around how one analyzes or a 990. A 990 provides numbers. People are coming to very different conclusions based on these very raw numbers because the analysis is open to interpretation. And so I'm not sure whether Dilnaz or anybody else, Shireen, you have any perspective on this, but there's been a lot of calls for some sort of regulator. I don't know how easy that is in reality. And we already have the IRS, of course. We have state regulation, we have federal, and so there are layers already to regulations that Muslim organizations, like all other organizations, have to adhere to.
I'm not going to answer that question, Oussama, but I am going to answer something else, which is about AI. And I think about AI, how important that is right now, right? Like it's not going to go away. So as a faith institution, I think it's so important for us to be readily using technology that is AI proficient and getting ourselves proficient in that as well, and making sure that we align ourselves with other faith organizations using AI, because this is really all faiths are talking about AI. And if we don't make sure that we're aligning ourselves with other faith organizations doing this work, again, then we're going to be siloed. So let's make sure that in our nonprofits, we're figuring out how to fundraise through AI, have AI part of our conversation, and as well as making sure it's an ethical use of AI as well. I think about that. I also think about the aspect of humility, how important the work that we do in fundraising and grant making is done with humility. And if we aren't doing it with humility, again, we're not doing it to get our name on a wall. We're really doing it as a pillar of our Islam. And how do we make sure that we're pleasing God as we do this?
Thank you. And we have a few questions in about 7 minutes to go. So one question from a student with us today, and whoever would like to take this question. As a student interested in philanthropy and nonprofit work, what role do you see the next generation of American Muslims playing in shaping more transparent, strategic, and impactful charitable giving?
I can jump in, Osama. I think this is very important. Thanks for the caring and about the community. We, of course, need more specialists and experts in this field, and we need more research around Muslim philanthropy. And also, that research needs to be translated into action in terms of mobilizing, training to organizations, giving some know-how toolkits into how we can mobilize resources, how we can unite forces, how we can come together. I also would say advocacy and policy are important aspects for the community, and any research around that, any actions to get the organization to start mindfully and strategically investing in this aspect is also important.
I'll jump in as well and just say I think that there's huge possibilities in sort of the rising generations and the way they think about social change. I think that young people are much more interconnected across building solidarity across different communities and issues. And I think that to them, it's very natural. For some of us, we had to really sort of learn and unlearn some of the biases that we hold. And I think younger people have just grown up in a more diverse and inclusive atmosphere. And so that makes the possibility of solidarity and creative giving, I think, that much more possible. I'll double down, I think, on what Mohamed said about going into and experimenting with different kinds of careers. I didn't know what philanthropy was when I was in college and kind of came into this through a pretty circuitous path. But organizations, I think Oussama mentioned, like ISF, give opportunities for young people to get resources to support their work in policy and media and narrative change. And I think those are really important opportunities. So I think that, and I will say one more thing, which is that we now have mentors. We have people who have come before us in these spaces. And so please reach out. I'm offering us as panelists, people at ISPU, to explore how to make an impact in some of these areas.
Lastly, I'd
Thanks,
like to,
Shireen.
one thing I wanted to say is like, just like we make Salat a community event, we get together for Salat as a community, we should get together at our kitchen table and make our Ramadan giving, our giving all year round, a community, a family event. So as we're getting together with our family, and it doesn't matter if you're giving $500 a year or even more than that, sit down and talk to your children and talk to your family about what are your values, what's your vision, what is your mission for your giving of this is zakat or sadaqah. Number two, think about like what is like some type of governance you want to do. Like start the kids young, start talking about governments and how you want to like maybe draft a policy of like what you want your children to do with their zakat and sadaqah. And lastly, think about like all the amazing organizations out there. Have you and your children research those nonprofits and figure out together collectively where are we going to give it. We make Salat, we make going for Hajj a community event. Make the Zakat a community event in your home as well.
Thank you, Dilnaz. So that was kind of about the role of the future generation of American Muslims. Now, just for 30 seconds each, please, just as we approach the end, where do you see the future of American Muslim philanthropy going these next 5, 10 years? And I'll ask for just 30 seconds. Mohammed?
Osama, you started with September 11th and the whole aftermath that the Muslim community has experienced. And I would say that most of the actions been reactive to everything the Muslim community has been going through. I think this is the time to go from reactive mobilization into proactive civic leadership. The American Muslim organizations possess moral legitimacy, community trust, growing philanthropic resources. The question is like what remains underdeveloped is institutionalize the infrastructure that converts these resources into sustainable policy influence. And this is the time that we need to join forces to make it happen.
I think about philanthropy and how it's very relational, and relational also means it's very much storytelling driven. So tell your story and make sure you're telling it and not allowing someone else to tell your story for you.
Thank you. I think maybe I'll just add that we really have a chance to merge the best of our faith and values from our community with the best practices that we're learning and understanding from legacy funding institutions. So some of those might be to invest in organizations to be successful and trust the leaders and have respect for the leaders of those organizations, as well as to leverage our relationships to build stronger coalitions and to be more effective in our work.
Thanks, Shireen. And we're rapidly now coming to an end of this 90 minutes. It's very quickly sped through. You might see, for those of you who are watching live, you'll see a poll that's popped up. So please, just before you leave, there's 3 or 4 questions there that we'd love you to participate in that poll. And just to summarize the conversation, I mean, number one, we started out by talking about the sheer strength and size of the Muslim philanthropic space. We're talking about a sizable chunk of money, an organization that gives beyond its gives more than other communities proportionally of its wealth. That's going to continue to grow. We spoke about the challenge of Islamophobia, a real challenge, which is well funded, which is a well-oiled machine. And that also is something that we need to tackle institutionally, yes, through education, but also through money, through activism, and through being better engaged on the issue of Islamophobia itself. We've spoken about what I would say the trust issue, for example, the controversies that we've seen, the maybe lack of compliance that many institutions are perhaps accused of, stemming from, I think what the four of us would say is a lack of investment in very important capacity building for our institutions. And so there is an education piece there. And someone asked the question, why is it so much harder to have the conversation in our community about overhead? And I think there are lots of reasons for that, but it's an education piece, I think, that's vital, that we must invest in compliance, in legal, in governance, and that takes money. And as Shireen shared with us, a minimum of 25% is what we're hearing nationally needed in investment in the so-called overhead question. We've looked at the issue of zakat. Of course, we need more folks paying their zakat, but also zakat and how we define zakat within those 8 categories is not something that the four of us are going to solve, but it's an ongoing discussion, ongoing debate. A, what can we do outside of zakat? And B, where this debate ends up will be very interesting in terms of whether or not the community respond to the latest ruling on political giving and how that shapes the zakat landscape. And then we've spoken about the potential. This fund, this 4.2 billion will continue to grow. And it will be very interesting as a new generation who are born here, who are raised in the United States, who, like Dilnaz said, have relationships, deep relationships with neighbors, with other communities, how they shape the future direction of American Muslim philanthropy, I think will also be very, very interesting. So thank you all. There's a lot to cover in what we felt was 90 minutes. It's never enough. Thank you for those of you who watched live. I would not be doing justice to my job as the chair of the development committee if I didn't make a plug for you to support ISPU. It is Ramadan. It's the last 10 nights if you're watching live. And so please do consider supporting ISPU, part of your philanthropic giving this Ramadan. ISPU is truly unique. It's why I was really interested to get involved. There is no organization that does the type of research for us and by us. And ISPU, therefore, needs your support. We punch way above our weight class. I think an organization of roughly 1.4 to 1.5 million dollars. And so you'll see a link in the chat. And so please, if you're not already a supporter, please do consider supporting ISPU. For those of you also watching this recorded, it's not too late. So with that, have a great day. Thank you all for joining. To our panelists, thank you so much for your expertise, for your time, for the work that you put into making American Muslim philanthropy what it is. And it's a conversation that's to be continued. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.